In the Vienna of my childhood, the Pressburger Bahn was a theatre train. It enabled the theatre goers of Bratislava to have a night out in Vienna and still make it back home after the curtain fell. The story of this train is a story of the 20th century, the century of nationalism.
From suburban railway, it became an international railway. It became a non-railway. It became a piece of archaeology.
Guten Tag, meine Frau. Hätten Sie zufällig Bücher über Alt-Wien, Reiseführer oder so?
Da hätte ich den Bedecker anzubieten.
Augenblick.
Du heißes leise alle Wunder.
Ja, das nehme ich schon, kein Problem. Danke.
Danke, auf Wiedersehen.
What I'm trying to do in this journey is, in some ways, to tell the history of what's happened in the 20th century to the greater part of Europe. My father was British, my mother came from Vienna. Yes, hasn't changed much. When we first came to Vienna, we used to live up in that second floor, the big flat. Then my father died, grandparents had moved in a smaller flat. We were in this spare room, my mother and my sister and myself. Much the same as before. The best way to see this is if you try and compare my father's family and my mother's family, the British part, the Austrian part. My father's family has been living in London, Britain, ever since Queen Victoria, throughout all the kings and queens since then. Never changing a regime, never changing frontiers, never being occupied. Very few countries in the world can say this. The United States can, few others. In Europe, no more than 3. Britain, Sweden, Switzerland. Look at it the other way, my mother's family. Here in Vienna, the melting pot, the epicenter of Central Europe. What happened to them? Every single place where they came from or moved to has changed countries, has changed regimes, often several times, is somewhere different, doesn't exist anymore. That's the point. The family, my mother's family, none of them, simply no longer anywhere in what used to be the old area of Central Europe.
So, what was this country, Austria, that you were living in at the time?
It was the rump of the old empire, the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, which, with its 10 different languages, which stretched from the Adriatic Sea to the borders of Switzerland, and then the other end to, in fact, what is now deep into Ukraine and deep into Poland. They had been a great empire. They wanted to be something else. They hadn't yet become a small but quite self-satisfied nation. Austria was a no place. Here's where the Pressburger Bahn began. On the street, Nothing's remained the same. The only thing that remains is the Landstraße, which, as the great Austrian statesman Metternich once said, is the high road to Asia. Asia begins at the Landstraße, he said. A railway from the capital city to an interesting provincial city. A provincial city with no less than 3 names. In 1913 it was called in German Pressburger, but it was also known as Pozsony because it was in the Hungarian part of the Habsburg Empire, and indeed for long the capital of the Kingdom of Hungary. It was ironic that this most ancient empire produced Europe's most modern railway. Moreover, this empire produced it just before it died in World War I. Pressburg became known by its Slovak name, Bratislava. The train hasn't gone all the way to Bratislava since Stalin brought down the Iron Curtain. Today, the line goes only as far as Wolfstal, the last stop before the Danube border, and the old Iron Curtain. I suppose it's symbolic, isn't it? The first stop from Vienna, out of Vienna, on the way to points east, is where all good Viennese would wish to end before they went further east. This building must be one of the very last of the great undertakings of the Habsburg monarchy. A monarchy which in some ways regarded Vienna as its capital, and in 1881 got all the famous people, Schubert, Mozart, Beethoven, transferred so that they would have their monuments here in this place. Most of the good Viennese came originally from provincial places in Hungary, in Moravia, in Slovakia, people like Freud and all the others, and ended up precisely here. The emperors didn't care one way or another about the nationalities. They were interested in the dynasty and in keeping all these various groups together. The history of the 20th century, these parts is what happened when this monarchy broke down. It broke into pieces, it's kept on recomposing and breaking into more pieces. There are probably more pieces in this area today than there ever were before.
The empire was dying before it was dead, primarily from national conflicts. This world for which this particular building was constructed is dead. And what's left of it? What's left of it is the memory. People tried to fit in the current presidents of Austria and the other famous figures, but somehow or other they're not quite big enough for the scale. In 1919, the new Austrian Republic, with no imperial potential and no imperial pretensions, issued an edict that no Habsburgs were to set foot within its borders unless they renounced all claim to the old throne. However, earlier this year, the edict was declared invalid. Austria had just joined the European Union, and not even an imperial ancestry can come between EU citizens and their rights.
Grüß Gott.
Grüß Gott.
Ich heiße Hobsbawm, komme aus London.
Nehmen Sie Platz, was kann ich tun für Sie?
Ja, ich suche das Grab meiner Eltern.
Wie hießen die Eltern?
Die Eltern ungefähr wie ich, H-O-B-S-B-A und ich glaube U-M. Hobsbawm.
Hobsbawm Nelly und Hobsbawm Berse, ist das so richtig?
Ja, das stimmt.
Haben gewohnt in der Unteren Weißgraber Straße 45 und die Nelly ist verstorben 1931. Ist das richtig? Und der Berse Hobsbawm, der Papa, ist verstorben am Tag nach meinem Geburtstag, am 11.02.29. Da sind die Hobsbawm.
Oh, 17th February, would need to be around here somewhere. Friedländer, Friedländer. Das muss irgendwie hier sein. In this area it's got to be. God knows, probably a flat thing which is deep under the earth now.
What do you remember about the grave?
For God's sake, I remember the exact opposite to what it is now, overgrown. It was in fact naked, nothing there. Can't read it. Charlotte. Well, 1929, 1931, 1934, parents and grandmother.
somewhere down below here.
Would you like ever to be buried there?
No. I'm an ex-Viennese, not a Viennese. Nobody left in the family here.
We are here within a particular area, a tiny area of conflict and friction. Within, say, a radius of 30 miles or so, you had the frontiers between Austria and the Turks, between Austrians, Germans and Hungarians, between Austrian, Germans and Czechs and Moravians and Slovaks, with a few Croats and whatever it is thrown in. All this broke into pieces. The world which broke up in Central Europe and which passed through the 20th century wasn't simply a backward area. This was an industrial world, a world in which people lived in towns, and as in here, they lived in industry. And after all, this kind of workshop, railway workshop, was no different from the railway workshop would have been in England at the time.
At the Railway Museum in Groß-Schwechat, they have preserved the original rolling stock of the Pressburger Bahn.
The most interesting detail of these wagons is the language. They are, in fact, bilingual in German and Hungarian. As in Hungary, Hungarian was the official language, and the Pressburger Bahn ran from one half of the empire into the other half, even if it only over 30 miles or so. It was essential to be officially bilingual.
Need a sense of national identity?
I think they need a sense of identity. They need to feel part of a group. Always have, always will. I don't think this needs to be mixed up with a sense of political statehood or anything like that. And I think that's where the trouble is.
What do you think a nation is?
There are at least two significant meanings of it, which tend to get mixed up. One is a nation is simply another word of saying a people inside a particular state, like the American nation, French nation. You might say a state in which the people counts politically. Almost say it's another word for democracy. The other is a nation is a body defined in particular ways, ethnically, linguistically, culturally, and so on. And it's a second one, particularly when it decides that forming an independent and sovereign state is a part of its rights. That's where the trouble starts.
Which was actually a border post on the Roman Empire here through Central Europe, on the other side of the Danube were the so-called barbarians, and here was so-called civilization.
Everybody, particularly in the West, thinks their civilization and their neighbors to the east or south are barbarians. Whether they really are is another matter. But that's one of the things that has damned the history of these parts, and presumably they did so from the days of the Romans on.
Why do you think a nation is so difficult to define?
Well, because nobody has a single identity. You always have these multiple identities between whom you choose, and depending on the situation, you may decide to be a Viennese or an Austrian or a British or whatever it might be, or for that matter something else. You may decide to be an old boy of your school. I think effectively nationality, insofar as it isn't defined by passports or some other documents, is defined negatively. It's defined against somebody else. There isn't anything positive. It's you are not, if you're around here, you are not a Croat, you are not a Hungarian, you are not a Czech, you are not a Slovak. What are you? You're an Austrian. And thirdly, because in fact, as we've already been, even if you do all that, the actual division is still arbitrary because there isn't a sharp line. How do you decide who is, let's say, a Jew? The Nazis decided anybody is a Jew who had one Jewish grandparent. The Israeli government says anybody is a Jew who is the child of a Jewish mother. Now, these very decisions, which are administrative decisions, demonstrate that there is no natural way of distinguishing somebody that is a Jew from a non-Jew. And that applies to a Czech, a German, an Austrian, or anybody you like.
Seeing the Danube takes me back to my childhood when I played on the banks of the Danube Canal in Vienna.
I supported my local team from when we lived in the East, which was Rapid, very good team, green and white. Alas, here once again the problem of identity comes in. I was, as it were, seen from outside by my school friends and others as both English and Jewish. So when, I think this was actually while I was at this school, there was a national match between England and Austria. And I listened to it with friends on the radio. They threatened, they said, wait, if England wins, you'll get it, you see. So I was desperately happy when in actual fact it turned out to be a draw. But on the other hand, other people said, you're a Rapid fan. How can you be a Rapid fan? Rapid, you're Jewish. There's a Jewish team in this. Hakoah, perfectly true. Very good team usually too. So I decided to hell with it. I was very sad about it because at that time Rapid was, as usual, top of the league. And Hakoah was right at the bottom. Still, I felt, noblesse oblige, and so I became for a while a Hakoah supporter, but it was no good. The heart wasn't in it.
Zu verhindern suchen. Gernhardt ist am Ball. Schuss! Tor! Und schießt die Melone. Das war das siegbringende Tor. 6:5 für Rapid.
Quite a good atlas. Probably that's why I kept it. Oh, and here we have a primitive example of political consciousness, 13-year-old. Pfui Hitler, down with Hitler. Then 5-pointed stars and 6-pointed star too, the Mogen David. I don't know what one reads into it. I didn't regard myself as being particularly politically developed at that stage, but there you are. Clearly something was happening.
What would you say I am in terms of nation? I was born in Austria. My mother's Austrian, so I have an Austrian passport. But my father's British, and I lived in Britain, and I have a British passport. So what am I?
If you have two passports, you're both Austrian and British. I see no particular problem about this. Look, if it comes to that, here's my passport, which is both British and European. I have no particular problem with that.
So that's the way you think that that's going, in a sense that you've got the British crest on a European community passport. That kind of combines nationalism and a supranational idea.
That's one way of doing it, but even if it were not combined in this way, I would have seen no difficulty about somebody being binational or even trinational. What is happening today is it is perfectly possible for people to live and work in 2 or possibly even 3 different countries. So why should their identity, as my identity is working in New York and London, somehow, why should it be different?
So in that sense, who do you think I should fight for if I have to have a conflict between the EEC and one of these 2 passports?
If you ask me, you shouldn't fight for your nation against other nations. Too much trouble has been caused by people doing this. Well, that's, you might say, the end of the line. Let nobody tell you that there are no sudden breaks in history. That's where it finishes. Nothing except a bit of empty space ahead and a war memorial over towards the left to remind you of what finished this line off. This war memorial, you've got to understand it if you want to understand anything about Central Europe. For us in the West, the Great War is the 1914 war. For people in Germany, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the great catastrophic war is the Second World War. You look at this war memorial, there are twice as many people killed in World War II as in World War I. You look at the families, they're the same families from the same village. There's one Nievergal here, First World War. There's 4 Nievergals, all in 1943, 1944, died in the Second World War, almost certainly on the Russian front. If you don't understand the trauma that World War must have meant for a small village like this and for any other small villages all over the place between Germany and Russia, you won't understand anything about what has been happening in Europe and what is happening today. Hitler annexed Austria and the adjoining parts of Czechoslovakia in 1938. He covered these fields with what was planned to be the largest factory in his Reich. The Pressburger Bahn was used to bring the building materials for these aircraft works, which were only finished in the spring of 1945 and so never went into production. The only way in which you can have a national state which is composed of a single homogeneous community, ethnically, linguistically and so on, is either by expelling everybody, or murdering everybody, or dividing it up. One way or another, it can only be done by the methods of barbarism. People didn't quite realize in 1918 that this was implied, although I believe the Turks had begun to experiment this. Assimilating forcibly the Kurds, expelling the Greeks, killing the Armenians. But during and after World War II, the logic of this kind of ethnic, linguistic nationalism became absolutely clear. And the logic was tragedy on a larger scale, I think, than ever before in European history. The Red Army restored the pre-war border, but not the Pressburger Bahn.
Seen from across the Austrian border, Czechoslovakia today is a country cut off from the West by an elaborate frontier designed to keep its inhabitants in rather than foreigners out. For a dozen years or so, it worked. Vast suburbs like this one in Bratislava sprang up. But in the last few years, the bargain has started to fall apart.
The official attitude of the communist regimes was that they were extremely keen on nationalism. They believed in the self-determination of nations defined by linguistic, cultural and other criteria. In practice, under Stalin, although the separate languages were indeed recognized and fostered, the control was absolutely central, and quite often attempts were made to subordinate them to Russia, including Russian language and culture. The Iron Curtain was opened in 1989 after Václav Havel's Velvet Revolution returned Czechoslovakia to democracy. At Berg, the old border station, the Pressburger Bahn, cars have now replaced the railway carriages and queue to enter Slovakia. With the Velvet Revolution, Havel managed to defeat the old Cold War communist regime, but he couldn't defeat the forces of Slovak nationalism, which then forced the Velvet Divorce and made Slovakia into the newest state in Europe. danger in a nation state which is based on ethnicity or something like that is that the inhabitants of that particular state, as it were, the state belongs to one of these groups and the others are less important, as for instance in Slovakia. Slovakia is not a state of everybody who lives in Slovakia. It belongs to the Slovaks, and the others are, as it were, guests or tolerated, or, in this case, might be not tolerated. And that's, once again, where the trouble starts. So here we are on this piece of almost industrial archaeology, thinking of what was once the straightforward line of communication between Vienna and Bratislava, and what is now at the moment superfluous to and unnecessary. Curious sensation. The Slovaks were one of the last European peoples to be awoken from their slumbers by the usual band of 19th century intellectuals and linguists. The irony is that you were more likely to meet a Slovak nationalist amongst the emigres in Pittsburgh than in the center of Pressburger. In Bratislava today, the number 11 tram still uses the tracks of the old Pressburger railway. As I came to the end of the line, I looked for the Reduta Cafe, which in its day had been a center of cabaret and culture, and now houses a casino. Here I met one of Bratislava's leading historians, Miklas Gazo. Mr. Gazo, great pleasure. Thank you. Let's sit down. You have lived here all or most of your life. You have lived under a very large number of different states.
Yes, it's very interesting. I was born in the first Czechoslovak Republic. Then this was autonomous Slovak Republic, then the Slovak Republic, then after 45 was the second Czechoslovak Republic, then was the Socialistic Czechoslovak Republic, then was Federal Czechoslovak Republic, and now it's the Slovak Republic.
And if you had been a year or two older, you would have lived in Hungary too?
Yes.
This square, there's a rather impressive statue outside. How long has it been there?
It's not long here, but because there were more statues. The first one was the statue of Maria Theresia.
The Empress?
Empress.
Yes.
And it was destroyed in 1921.
It was destroyed by whom?
It was destroyed by Czech legionnaires.
Czech nationalists, yes.
Yes. And one piece I got, it was formed in such ornaments, I don't know who did it, but here is written M. Theresia Denkmal, 1897 to 1921.
So, in a way, history is recycled for other purposes.
Yes.
And what happened to the square after they took the statue down?
The pieces were used for other statues. for instance, of Palatsky, as you can see here.
Palatsky, of course, was the Czech national figure,
yes.
Czechoslovak national figure, yes.
And then was erected a statue of Stefanik. This is a Slovak hero. He stands before a column. On the top of this column was a lion and the Czechoslovak symbols. In 1939, this lion was put down. Hitler told by his visit in Petržalka that this cat must get down. And afterwards, the Stefanik statues stood alone, but under the totality, under communism, was then destroyed and melted. And afterwards was erected this statue of Stur.
Who is Stur?
Stur was the codificator of the Slovak language, and it was a great person of our history.
All this stuff I produce, or people like me produce the raw material for them. Except the people who put up this statue and all the others, they're not interested in history. They're interested in stories, in myth, in fairy tales, in mutually incompatible fairy tales. They change, they swap around.
The leader of the Czech Republic, Václav Klaus, says last night's decision to split with Slovakia will lead to two independent states, not a confederation. At a meeting in Bratislava, the two sides set up an interim federal government to arrange the separation by the end of September. EC ministers have warned they'll live to regret it.
Czechoslovakia's leaders met to discuss their country's future and decided it didn't have one, at least not as the federation that's existed for the past 74 years. The rifts highlighted in last month's elections have now become an all-out split, exactly what the Slovak leader Vladimir Mečiar wanted and what his Czech counterpart Václav Klaus did not.
The stirrings of Slovak nationalism are everywhere. What was just local colour in the communist years is now the expression of a demand to break with Prague. When we wanted our independence before, we got only polite smiles. Now we need our own constitution. The nationalist voice is about to be heard, and its leader is a force that Prague must reckon with.
Tento kút najkrajší, kde znie sladko reč, štíty hôr, hrdá zem, čo všetkých volá sem. Maličká krajina, krajšiu nenájdeš. Viva Slovakia, v láske môžeš rásť.
Prime Minister Mečiar may put on a modern face, but his nationalism has shades of the last time Slovakia was independent as a fascist puppet of the Nazis. He broke away from Czechoslovakia without ever putting it to a referendum. 3 years on, Mečiar has clamped down on the use of minority languages and resurrected the old Cold War law banning criticism of the state.
Good music is one of the very few positive products of nationalism. In Bratislava's old city theatre, which is now the Slovak National Opera, I met Peter Dvorsky, the latest in a long line of eminent Slovak singers like Lucia Pop and Edita Gruberova, who began their careers here. Ja, ich erinnere mich noch als kleiner Bub in Wien, wie noch die Theaterzüge auf der Pressburger Bahn gefahren sind. Von Wien nach Pressburg oder umgekehrt von Pressburg nach Wien, und dann um Mitternacht nach dem Theater sind die Leute wieder zurückgefahren. Wäre doch schön, wenn sowas wieder existierte.
Das wäre wunderschön. Ich habe über diese Bahn nur habe ich gehört, aber leider habe ich das nicht erlebt. Aber ich wünsche mir von Herzen, dass diese Bahn wieder kommt und die Wiener Publikum nach Bratislava kommt, so gern wie wir kommen nach Wien.
Well, it would be very nice. It would be even better if the people who get in at Vienna wouldn't have to bother about whether they get the name of this city right. Because if they called it Pressburg or Pozsony, that somebody over here would get annoyed and insulted because as a Slovak city, it must be called Bratislava. It's all three. It's always been all three.
Hoi, Tank Tom! Hoi, Tank Tom! Hoi, Tank Tom! Hoi, Tank Tom! God neem along, God neem along! Hoi, Tank Tom! God neem along, God neem along! Hoi, Tank Tom! God neem along, God neem along! Hoi, Tank Tom! God neem along, God neem along! Hoi, Tank Tom! God neem along, God neem along! Hoi, Tank Tom! God neem along, God neem along!
Machtwort 1 von Machtwort 121. Kommen.
The world today seems schizophrenic. On the one hand, they are building a new line to link Vienna and Bratislava, Eastern and Western Europe. On the other hand, at this point, this is also the front line of the new electronic border, which has been installed by the European Union against poor illegal immigrants from outside. The growth in global business and tourist traffic demands cross-border solutions. The Pressburger Bahn is being rebuilt. This is not out of nostalgia, but because it stops at Vienna's Schwechat airport, which for many Slovaks is now their local airport. In the long term, the present bus routes cannot cope with the demand generated by the worldwide growth in air traffic. If you want a symbol of the end of the millennium, here it is. A large, enclosed space. You don't know, looking around it, where you are, not in what town, although I know it's Vienna, not in what country, not in what continent. All that surrounds you are the names of international airlines, the symbols which are supposed to be comprehensible to anybody, irrespective of language, and of course the English language, the international pidgin of the late 20th century, and the transnational stores. And yet the people who go in and out of here from all the continents, they know who they are, they know what their identity is, and they'll continue to know it. And so do I. As I come in and as I go out of this, my own identity is not destroyed, even though I live in a society very different from the villages and small communities in which my ancestors once lived. My hope is that people will learn not to love each other, because human beings are not necessarily purely loving, but they will learn to coexist even with the people they don't much like as neighbors, sometimes even working with them in the same country, in the same economy, in the same world.